Hello and welcome. My name's Philip and today I'd like to tell you about a person who is often considered the first Norman. His name was Hrólfr, though he's more commonly known as Rollo, and he was a Viking. Often when people are taught about the Normans, they begin with the conquest of England in 1066. The Normans are presented more of a sort of random bunch of belligerent Frenchmen who just spontaneously popped up on the other side of the English Channel. Not only is this super wrong, being mostly the result of an anti-French narrative that developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it also ignores about 100 years of Norman history and culture. The Normans had a distinct cultural identity that lasted well into the 13th century, and the roots of that identity are not French, but Viking. The story of Normandy begins with Viking raids, longships sailing up the Seine to terrorise Paris and the kingdom of West Francia. Among these raiders was a proud, ambitious leader by the name of Hrólfr. Where Hrólfr came from originally is a matter of some debate. Unfortunately, Vikings were not the best at keeping records, and so most accounts of them are actually written sometime after the fact. Some of the main sources that recount the deeds of Hrólfr are written centuries later by his descendants. Most contemporary accounts of Viking raids were written by the victims and have their own biases. It doesn't help that most of these sources use the terms Viking, Norwegian, and Dane pretty much interchangeably. Some sources explicitly claim Hrólfr was Norwegian, whilst others state firmly he was Danish. Dudo of Saint-Quentin falls into the latter camp, and I'm inclined to agree with him, as he was writing less than a century after Hrólfr's death, and was in fact commissioned to write a biography by Hrólfr's grandson. Wherever he came from, it's agreed that he was a member of the aristocracy. Dudo claims that his father was a Danish nobleman who, for whatever reason, had attracted the ire of the King of Denmark. When Hrólfr's father died, his brother Gurim was killed, and Hrólfr was forced to flee his homeland. Now, turning exile into opportunity, he decided to join the Viking raids into Francia with an eye to finding a new home. The first Viking raids into the kingdom of the Franks was in 799, however they didn't begin in earnest until the 830s. This was due to civil wars in Francia, which meant there was little organised resistance to the foreign warriors. These new attacks culminated in 845, when a Viking army laid siege to Paris. Led by a chieftain named Ragnar, whom some historians have tentatively identified as the legendary hero Ragnar Lothbrok, the city survived thanks to King Charles the Bald paying a ransom of some 7,000 livres of silver and gold. The Vikings returned to Paris again and again to collect more ransoms over the coming years, and the north of Francia was ripe for an exiled hero seeking to carve out a kingdom. In 876, Hrólfr, now leading an army of like-minded warriors, seized the city of Rouen. The Frankish counts mounted a counterattack, but eventually conceded large parts of the coastal provinces to Hrólfr. Things seemed to be going well, and in 885 he joined up with the armies of two Danes named Siegfried and Cynric to partake in one of the now fairly regular raids against the city of Paris. The Vikings arrived outside the city on the 24th or 25th of November, but unfortunately for Hrólfr, Paris was no longer the easy target of years past. Odo, the Count of Paris, refused to pay the Vikings tribute, rallied his city and manned the defences, leading a spirited repulsion of the marauders. The Viking army, not willing to take no for an answer, began a siege of the city. For 2 months, the Vikings tried every trick in the book, but couldn't breach the city's walls or convince the Parisians to surrender. In the early months of the new year, the besieging army began to venture away from the city walls, pillaging Le Mans, Chartres and Évreux. As the siege wore on, morale began to dwindle. When some of the Parisians sallied in order to collect supplies, Siegfried asked them for 60 pounds of silver and abandoned the siege in April. Hrólfr and his men remained, however, keeping pressure on the defenders and hoping their will would break first. In May, disease began to spread in Paris. This could have seen victory for the Vikings had not Count Odo slipped through their lines in order to petition the King of West Francia, Charles the Fat. Odo returned with the king's armies and drove the Vikings back to their ships. In the summer, they made one final attempt to breach the city, but were repulsed. When October arrived, so did a larger Frankish army, and the besieging Vikings were scattered. Hrolfr's army, unwilling to back down, was surrounded by the king's army. Instead of slaying the uppity Dane, however, King Charles saw in him an opportunity. See, Burgundy was in open revolt against the king, and so Charles made Hrolfr an offer. He would allow the Vikings to sail further up the Seine and ravage the lands of Burgundy, taking whatever booty they could find. Once weakened, the king would bring the rebellious Burgundians to heel. What's more, he would actually pay Hrolfr for his service, promising 700 livres in silver and safe passage out of Frankish lands. Hrolfr was clearly a shrewd man, seizing the opportunity. Much to the dismay of the Parisians, who had hoped for vengeance against the invaders, King Charles kept his word. This act later caused a number of conflicts in the line of French succession, but that's not a story for today. What is important though is that Hrolfr had learned something very valuable, something that became a key part of Norman philosophy. People will pay you to fight their enemies, and more often than not, you will gain far more from it than your employer. Just look at Sicily and Ireland. And the Fourth Crusade! Emboldened and wealthy, it wasn't long before Hrolfr and his army resumed raiding the northern provinces. In 885, or possibly 889, Hrolfr captured the city of Bayeux. In Bayeux, Hrolfr met the Frankish noblewoman Poppa, whom he married and who gave birth to their son Wilhelm Langespjot, or William Longsword, in 893, and their daughter Gerloc, also named Adela, in 912. Having carved out a small coastal territory for himself, Hrolfr's ambitions continued to grow, and in 911 he once more led his army up the Seine and besieged the city of Chartres, 56 miles southwest of Paris. The siege did not go well. According to local legend, the Bishop Gonthelm held aloft the Virgin's tunic, a sacred relic, which inspired a mob of peasants to charge the Vikings and force them to fall back. By this point, a different Charles was king of West Francia. This time known as King Charles the Simple, he was the cousin of Charles the Fat. King Charles the Simple led his army of heavy cavalry to relieve Chartres, and pursued the Norsemen as they fled from the city. Knowing they would not have time to board their boats and set sail before the cavalry was upon them, Hrolfr came up with a clever ploy. He ordered his men to start rounding up and slaughtering nearby livestock, including their own cattle that they had brought with them. The stench of blood and braying of beasts was enough to spook the Frankish horses, causing them to panic and buck and stopping the cavalry charge in its tracks. Unable to lead his horses on, King Charles decided to take a leaf from his cousin's book and negotiate with the canny Viking warlord. Between Charles and Hrólfr, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte was created. In it, Charles sought to turn poachers into gamekeepers by legally granting the lands that Hrólfr held between the river Epte and the sea in freehold and good money. In exchange, Hrólfr swore loyalty to the king and to defend Francia from any other Viking raiders. Charles also granted Hrólfr the land of Brittany for his livelihood, which is rather bold considering that Brittany at the time was an independent country that Francia had attempted and failed to conquer. Another stipulation of the contract was that Hrólfr had to convert to Christianity, as did his people. The Franks had always struggled with Hrólfr's name, preferring instead to call him Rollo, and so he took the baptismal name Robert. In Norman French, though, he was known simply as Roux. Though some sources also state that Hrólfr had to secure the alliance by marrying Charles's daughter Gisela, there are no other records of her, and so she's taken on a legendary status as a Christian princess who may never have actually existed. Dudo also tells a rather funny story here, wherein the king says that Hrólfr must prove his fealty by kissing his feet. Hrólfr replies that he will not kneel to any man, let alone kiss their feet, so as a compromise, he has one of his warriors come forward to do it. Now, this man steps forward uneasily, and instead of lowering himself down to the king's feet, he grabs King Charles by the ankle, lifts him up to his mouth, causing the king to topple over backwards, much to the amusement of the Vikings. Whether that's true or not, we can never know, but it does show the difference between the courtly manners of the Franks and the pragmatism of the Vikings. Already the Norsemen of Hrólfr's lands had been intermarrying with locals, blending their language with the northern French dialect to create something new. The name Norseman became Norman, and the lands they held were named Normandy. Hrólfr divvied up the land he had been granted among his chieftains and settled himself at the new capital of Rouen. The following years were spent settling the Viking raiders and building his new homeland. This could have been the end of the tale, but in 923 Charles the Simple abdicated the throne. With Charles no longer king, Hrólfr felt that his promise of fealty was null and void, and so began raiding once again, this time sending his armies westward. A fresh agreement was hastily drawn up by the new king Rudolf that conceded more territory to the Normans. The agreement doesn't mention whether or not Hrólfr managed to assert lordship over the Vikings who had already settled the new territory, or whether they were ousted and replaced by his own subjects. But by the time of his death, at some point between 928 and 933, the Normans had become a distinct cultural identity, and they were just getting started. So the Normans were not just some random Frenchmen. Theirs was a culture built upon risk and enterprise, on striking out and fighting for what you want. Their Viking roots gave them a sense of adventure and a meritocratic approach to society. But they weren't just conquerors. They learned to adapt, to negotiate, to integrate different customs and systems so as to gain as much as possible from every encounter. It's what made them so effective and so dangerous to the rest of medieval Europe. And their conversion to Christianity only increased their success, as they strove to prove their worth not just to each other, but to God himself, winning wars and building gigantic cathedrals. And all that starts with Hrólfr. His son William Longsword and grandson Richard the Fearless brought those principles to bear and forged Normandy into a major political player and a force to be reckoned with. Hrolfr's descendants ruled Normandy until 1204 and still rule England to this day. One particular descendant could well be considered the most important Norman in all of English history. And no, it's not who you think. Thanks for watching. Farewell. So there's a character in the Vikings TV show who is called Rollo, who seems to be based roughly alongside sort of Hrolfr. A lot of the things he does kind of have parallels. The timeline doesn't actually add up, so we can't say that it is Hrolfr, but it's nice to see that he's getting a bit of attention, at least. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a show about him one day. The Normans.